So on the topic of modern-day social justice, I wanted to bring in Harold Bloom, who is a very old, I think he must have taught for 40 years now, and he still teaches out of his house a little bit. Harold Bloom is a literary critic, and he believes that there are great works, and he especially thinks that Shakespeare is, and Dante, and all kinds of other things. He does believe in a Western Canon, and what I have in front of me is exactly that, the Western Canon, a book that he wrote, the books and school of the ages, and just point out where he talks about the social justice movement, because I think it's interesting to get another perspective, especially from someone in academia who's been there a long time and is against it. And so what he calls these people is he calls it the school of resentment. So this is on page 4. So this is what Harold Bloom says. So he says, the school of resentment who wish to overthrow the canon in order to advance their supposed and non-existent programs for social change. I hope that the book does not turn out to be an elegy for the Western canon, although what's funny is the next chapter actually is called the elegy, and that perhaps at some point there will be a reversal and the rabblement of lemmings will cease to hurl themselves off the cliffs. So let me keep going though. So that's just at the beginning what he says. He calls it the school of resentment, and of course for those who are quite aware of the social justice movement, that of course makes a great amount of sense. And so on page 16, he provides an exemplar, and I actually remember him talking about this in one of his Charlie Rose interviews. So he starts out with a quote. He says it's from Oscar Wilde, and Oscar Wilde says that all bad poetry is sincere, which is a funny phrase, suggesting that people who write poetry and the people who are poorly write poetry don't know they're poor, and of course write it very sincerely. Harold Bloom believes that phrase, all bad poetry is sincere, should be put at the gate of every university, like as a motto, as something as a warning. So anyways, for that quote, he points out that a particular person called Maya Angelou, who was a poet and got some award, he suggests that she wrote sincerely. And he does that in the interview as well. It's funny. He basically thinks that these people are promoted less for their merit and more for their backgrounds, more for irrelevant criterion like their race or sex or sexuality, etc. And he thinks that is an awful criterion to be using to select for a Western canon. And so he doesn't think that Maya Angelou is producing great works. And yet she's awarded. Why? Because of the perception. Because, hey, look, if we award people who are from minority groups, that is supposedly going to uplift the confidence of other people who are from that minority group, and they can say, oh, look, this person did it, so I can too. So apparently that's the mindset of people, right? They can't feel pride or feel respect for or feel that they can praise someone who does well, no matter what race or sex or sexuality they come from or religion or whatever. Instead, we have this tribalist mentality, at least the regressive left and the social justice warriors. They suggest that no, people are tribal and people need to feel group affiliations, and no one will feel confident unless someone like them that share their skin color are doing well. Otherwise, they can't feel pride in someone of a different race who does well. So that's a very racist view of regressive leftists when they think that way. He also points out on the same page that he says with doubtless irony, the New York Times interviewer who said that we are all feminist critics, and then Harold Bloom says that is the rhetoric suitable for an occupied country, one that expects no liberation from liberation. So obviously he's pointing out that everyone having this is just a new orthodoxy, and they expect to find liberation by forcing everyone to appeal to an orthodoxy, like a feminist critic. We're all feminists now, as if that is freedom, if that is liberation, that's free thought. Well, obviously it's not. So when people say, well, obviously I'm a feminist, usually those people have no idea what they're talking about, but the more insidious ones, of course, are looking to just create a new orthodoxy. On page 21, he talks about what the Western canon is supposed to be. So he says, nothing is so essential to the Western canon as its principles of selectivity, which are elitist only to the extent that they are founded upon severely artistic criteria. So I think his point there is saying that the only thing elitist about it, elitism typically means that there's a group of people that have to rule, a group of people that are selected, and they're the ones that are in control. And often when you think of elitism, you think of like a class situation. So the rich or the wealthy, the people who are connected, that is elitism. It's like a clique, it's a group that you can't get into. Sometimes the feminists would call it the old boys club. That's what's supposed to be elitist. But what is elitist about merit? What is elitist about standards and criterion? Well, what will the leftists say, the regressive leftists? They'll say that some people can't meet the standard. And so it is like a new old boys club, because not everyone can get in no matter what they do. Now, is that a legitimate criticism to have a Western canon, to have standards? Because obviously standards imply that there is a benchmark, and if you can't meet the benchmark, then you don't get in. So elitism in terms of merit, I think for us to accept that you can have an elitism, like that's a derogatory term, as if it's unfair. Elitism, as I said before, in terms of the old boys club or a class scenario, these things are based on irrelevant criterion. This is based on a clique. This is based on a racket or a cartel, right? Like a union, like a workers' union, trade union or labor union. This is based on a clique. Only some people are in and some people are not. What makes it a bad thing is the kind of criterion. Now, is merit a bad criterion? Are progressive leftists going to say that medical staff are elitist because they have very high standards? You get into very, I think, murky territory when you start to suggest that standards and ability and success and achievement are elitist. I think then you breed a society of either mediocrity or poverty when that is your view. Another point Bloom makes on page 24, he says, originality is the great scandal that resentment cannot accommodate, and Shakespeare remains the most original writer we will ever know. So again, this is another very good point about what is a great work of art. Originality, what he is suggesting here, and he talks about this in the Charlie Rose interviews too, is that a common criticism of, again, the social justice types and basically the postmodernists is that Shakespeare and even Obama, remember when Obama said, "You didn't build that." This is something that just didn't come out of Obama's mouth. This is the odor of the culture, of the academic culture, really, that suggests that nothing is new and that people are constantly borrowing from other people, and they really can't claim ownership for their work. In a sense, that Shakespeare cannot claim ownership for his work because he was part of a certain society, he was a white male in England, all these things. And what the point is, and this is what Harold Bloom talks about, is he says that all kinds of people are trying to make a case that the work of Shakespeare and others are a product of their environment, not a product of their person. So therefore, Shakespeare can't be awarded, can't be deemed the creator, the inventor, the great one of his works, because he was merely a product of his upbringing or his associations or his education or whatever it might be. The same sentiment that Obama says about, "You didn't build that," right? Of course, this is a humongously anti-American sentiment. The American sentiment is self-reliance and that you can do things. It is possible. It's a free country. That's the motto of America. And so all kinds of people are trying to break down this idea of individual merit. They're trying to destroy the individual in a sense. And one way of doing this is destroying their ownership in their works and suggesting that this person didn't do this. This person wasn't a great mind. He was simply a product of his time. And so originality, as he says here, that is something that the school of resentment cannot accommodate. It's not something that's possible to them. Here's something that I disagree with, but it's still interesting. It's on page 28. He says, if we read the Western Canon in order to form our social, political, and personal moral values, I firmly believe we will become monsters of selfishness and exploitation. To read in service of any ideology is not, in my judgment, to read at all. The reception of the aesthetic power enables us to learn how to talk to ourselves and how to endure ourselves. The true use of Shakespeare or of Cervantes, of Homer or of Dante, of Chaucer or of Rabelais is to augment one's own growing inner self. Reading deeply in the canon will not make one a better or a worse person, a more useful or more harmful citizen. The mind's dialogue with itself is not primarily a social reality. All that the Western Canon can bring one is the proper use of one's own solitude, that solitude whose final form is one's confrontation with one's own mortality. So he's evoking the Socrates thing here, that we learn how to die well, right, through this kind of education. What's strange about Bloom is he doesn't care much about morality, and he talks about that a little bit in the Charlie Rose stuff too. He says that he doesn't think it should be a part of any of this kind of stuff. Morality, he sees that as something, I guess, external or something else, but not connected to great literature. But another thing that to keep in mind is that often what is said is that literature provides a very good study of humanity. You could think of like psychology or biology, but often people will say it is literature that helps us study the most about human nature and our status and predicament in this existence. Some people also say history, because you can learn about what people did under certain circumstances. Biology as to what's possible for man. Psychology, I guess, similarly about what's possible for the mind of man. And you have literature that experiments with actions and situations, dystopias, for example, tragedies, what people do in circumstances, and how people can relate to one another, how people can screw each other in some ways. And so all of these conversations, you read Iago and you read Othello, both in Othello, obviously, you see the conflict between these two people, and it gives you a view into what could be part of your own personality. And so when he's speaking about reading literature, I guess he wants to get away from the politics. He wants just to discuss the internal workings of the person, the kinds of things that you grip with in your life, and ultimately how we deal with an existence that's temporary. Is there purpose in living in a temporary existence? And what can we get out of this existence? And the meaning what we must constantly be harvesting to make living worthwhile. I think that would probably be a good way of putting what he's saying here. Because we don't have the situation of non-existence, and we don't have the situation of complete existence or inevitable undying existence. That would be another dilemma, and meaning would be probably impossible in such a situation. What would you do if you lived forever? Because you could always do it tomorrow. So what would you do in the present? I think it would be incomprehensible, and I think it would be extremely boring and a useless existence. But the irony of humanity is that we live temporarily and thus live completely. We must. So literature is supposed to, great literature, Tolstoy, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, etc. They're supposed to speak to that existence, this existence that we have. On the next page, he says that one ancient test for the canonical remains fiercely valid. So what the ancient test for something to be something that's part of the canon. Unless it demands rereading, the work does not qualify. Rereading. So I think what he would suggest is that let's say nonfiction, we'll make an easy case first. Nonfiction, do you have to reread nonfiction? Well, if you go through the book and you learn what you can from it, you make notes from it maybe, you don't have to reread the book again, unless you've forgotten something. But literature, great works of literature, are supposed to be something that takes some time to process. So this is another reason why I think he hates vulgar literature. So, for example, I know he said that he thinks Ayn Rand is a waste of time. The reason why I don't think Ayn Rand is a waste of time is because her ideas are very interesting. But the thing is, the reason why I think Bloom doesn't like it is because they're overt. They're not hidden and packaged and requiring endless digging, which Bloom loves to do. They are more overt. They are available. They are there. They are explicit. They are naked. They are there for your criticism, your consideration. But Bloom doesn't like that. He doesn't like gems unearthed on the surface, on the beach, to be picked up and examined. He likes the digging process. And so the rereading process. He likes the layers. He likes you read it once, you get a sense of the story. You read it again, you start looking into the characters. You read it again, you find some hidden meanings. This is what he likes, this process, these layers. the complexity, perhaps. He likes that aspect of it. He doesn't like gems sitting on the beach. He thinks that those gems are, I don't know. It's my metaphor. This rereading the process he likes. Maybe he thinks that the process of reading a book a few times, a play a few times, maybe he thinks that process is something that is where you not only are finding new things in it, but also maybe you're also learning and starting to integrate that material within yourself, or maybe that rereading process is something that is important. And the reason why I'm saying that is because maybe he thinks that books that are more overt and more like The Fountainhead, for example, which I'm reading again, and I'm almost done, the speeches that are made by certain characters, very overt, political. When, for example, Tui says that if you want to control people, control their souls, make them feel small, make them feel that they can't accomplish anything, make them feel they have to appeal to the group. This is overt. This is vulgar, and for Bloom. But they're fascinating ideas. They're political ideas. They're ideas of how people manipulate each other. They're ideas of how people command, how demagogues arise. But Bloom would rather that be subtle. If it's going to be an idea, it has to be something that takes a bit of time to extract. He doesn't like that it's on the surface. On page 30, he talks about the problem of today of having so little time and the explosion of information. So he says, and the reason to be selective. So he says that if we were literally immortal, or even if our span were doubled to 70 years, say, we could give up all arguments about canons. But we have an interval only, and then our place knows us no more, and stuffing that interval with bad writing in the name of whatever social justice does not seem to me to be the responsibility of the literary critic. So he says that because we are only here for 80 years or so, right, the average, 80, 85, we necessarily need to be selective. And we should try to pick some of the best stuff, because we don't have the time to read everything. In a sense, we don't have time to discover by accident great works. We should instead take the advice of people who have spent 40 years, like Bloom, reading, and sample from what he thinks is the best. Now, of course, that certainly doesn't mean that new good stuff can't be created. It just simply says that it's in the sake of time, in the sake of efficiency, in the sake of our limited time here, it would be best to sample from what we know as the best, and that is the canon. The canon is the safekeeping of the best writing humanity has to offer, and should always be the starting place of literature. And then certainly from there, you could find new works that are good. And now more on social justice on page 33. He says, we are destroying all intellectual and aesthetic standards in the humanities and social sciences in the name of social justice. Our institutions show bad faith in this. No quotas are imposed upon brain surgeons or mathematicians. What has been devalued is learning as such, as though erudition were irrelevant in the realms of judgment and misjudgment. So it's funny, he says in the middle there about the quotas. He's saying that we don't put race and sex and sexuality quotas on brain surgeons and mathematicians. We don't have an underachieving minority group for a mathematician just because we think it looks good. But we do that for a lot of other things. We would do that for a Nobel Prize. We would do that for certain academic positions in literature, English literature, other humanities and social sciences. Here's another important point about the canon, which is something that has been gripping me quite a bit. He says that cognition cannot proceed without memory, and the canon is the true art of memory, the authentic foundation for cultural thinking. Memory is so important. If you can think of Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens, with all his names. If you read, for example, his Letters to a Young Contrarian, it is riddled with names, references. Hitchens, while intelligent, perhaps his greatest gift was his memory, and perhaps Harold Bloom might be in the same camp. Memory is immensely important, because the more you can remember, the more you can tie things together, the more things you can think of together at the same time, and perhaps create new integrations, perhaps create new concepts. The more things you can hold in memory, more things you can think about at a time, The greater memory, of course, the more things you have access to use. And the less you'll have to reread stuff, the more you'll be able to read something and retain it. It is immensely important, and from what I know, memory is very little regarded in the schools today. We used to memorize things, memorize multiplication tables, for example, memorize poems to recite in front of the class, but I don't think they do that kind of stuff so much anymore. Memory is not considered important. Right now, critical thinking is what's considered important, but even then it's a bit of a cliche, because you have to critically think with something, and that's where they lose the battle there. You have to learn things first, and reminds me of Nietzsche's idea of the camel, the lion, and the child. And let's talk about the first one. He talks about, this is in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He says that the camel is the first stage, and it's when he calls it the beast of burden, the animal that is well loaded. It's supposed to be the person that is saturated with knowledge, and that the first, perhaps 10 years, maybe a little less, of a child's life is spent memorizing and absorbing tons of material, and children are fit for that. They can do that very well, and that's the time to load them up. Not think about it necessarily. That comes later. It could even also consider the trivium. It has the same thing. The trivium has the same pattern as Nietzsche's pattern. Logos, grammar, rhetoric, logic, grammar, rhetoric. You have knowledge, then you learn to use the knowledge, think about it, then you learn to present the knowledge with rhetoric. That's the same kind of thing here. Memory is so important, and I think we've lost that. We lost a bit of that, and if we lose our memories, if our memories are not of capacity that we need, we will spin, we will progress, we will not make any progress. And one more point from Bloom is on page 61. This is his chapter on Shakespeare. So he takes a second to talk about what he calls the partisans of resentment, and he says that the partisans of resentment might stress that only an elite can be so educated, and he says as our more truthful moments inform us, it has become harder and harder to read deeply as the century grows older. And then just a little bit further down he says, I sometimes wonder if a critical preference for context over text does not reflect a generation made impatient with deep reading. So that, I think, is probably Bloom's main point, main diagnosis of our times, suggesting that people are impatient with deep reading, and rather than try to get something out of Shakespeare, they would rather criticize Shakespeare for the author and who the author was. They don't want to spend the time and the patience to dig and to find the layers, as Bloom would probably say. They instead would rather look at the author and criticize the man, forget what he did, look at who he was, and criticize him, essentially guilty but before innocence, in terms of, well, if he's a white male from England, then he's what? Then you fill in the blanks, right? But we have, so far we've read nothing of his works. We've only condemned him for who he is. This is the new racism. Like this fills with dirt the container of the deep reading one could get out of literature. But I think that certain places in the world will keep what Ayn Rand would call the banner of reason forward. There'll be some places in the world that will keep the canon and will not fall under the social justice group. You may know of a professor called Jonathan Haidt, and that's spelled Haidt. He is perhaps a leader in a movement against the regressive left and the social justice warriors taking over universities. And he wrote a very important article which differentiates the John Stuart Mill Truth University, he calls it, types, and the social justice types. I can't remember what person he used for that. Not John Stuart Mill, but someone else. And he identified the University of Chicago as the main center for Truth University, and that probably because you may know that University of Chicago released a letter to their students and to the public that said that you want to come to the University of Chicago, there will be no safe spaces, you will learn a lot, and you will be expected to read and write critically. and get something out of it. And Haidt identified the leader of the social justice universities as Brown University. I don't know what Brown did, but somehow they got that title. And so there will be places in the world where greatness will continue amongst the universities that are destroying themselves, that will alienate good faculty, just like bad money alienates good money. Bad money gets rid of good money. So will bad professors and bad teaching and bad faculty will get rid of good faculties and good content and good courses. And the average person who has no idea what they're doing, they will go to these colleges that are corrupt, and they will get nothing out of it, and they will resent the school of resentment. They will resent being poorly educated. The people who are in the know, the people who understand what's going on, they have always prevailed, even if they have to be in a secret society in some cases. They prevail. They know what standards are. They know what universities provide them, or at least what professors provide them. And with their children, they will seek out a good education. If it can't come from the public schools, then it will come from private schools or home schools that teach the proper greatness that we can have from our species literature and science and etc. And it will carry on. And I guess Harold Bloom's message to us is that this is something we have to defend and something that we can't let go away, because it is safeguarding the best that we have accomplished so far. And if we want to continue accomplishing, then we have to safeguard what we have